This is For the Governed, a podcast series brought to you by Athalonz. Here are your hosts, Tim Markison and Ron Cates.
Welcome to another edition of the Athalonz podcast. This one is sobering and I think stunning. I'm Ron Cates. With me is Tim Markison, the CEO and founder of Athalonz. As we've discussed before, Tim, you are a victim of child sexual abuse.
Yes.
And recently you had a pretty deep dive into some of the numbers and statistics. And even though both of us are pretty aware of what's going on in this realm, we were both astounded by the size of the numbers.
Yep.
So a look at abuse numbers, Tim.
Yeah, so that's our sober topic for today. But I think, as you said, that these numbers are shocking. And I have been dealing with the issues of being sexually abused as a child for over 30 years, and when I was going through this stuff, I was overwhelmed with the numbers. So let's begin with just the numbers with respect to child sexual abuse. So, and I've heard these numbers for a while.
Well, they essentially haven't changed in decades.
And since I started dealing with it 30 years ago. So it's estimated, and it has to be estimates because there's no accurate way to count. And even if a survey could ask every individual, there's a fair number of people that wouldn't answer honestly, that if they were abused, they wouldn't answer that they were abused.
Correct.
For a variety of reasons. One is, they were in fear. So basically, if you would have asked me as a child, was I being abused? I'd have said absolutely not, because I was too afraid of my perpetrators, and they made it clear that if I spoke, I would be in big, big trouble, if not killed.
But there's also shame involved in a lot of cases, because the perpetrator makes you feel like you're a terrible person and you deserve this somehow. So. And then just the whole topic is so taboo, it's difficult to discuss or admit to.
Right. And add on to that disassociation. So for me, I disassociated when the abuse was happening. So, my direct memory of a lot of that stuff is sparse. And, in my early adulthood, it was all gone. So if you'd have asked me in my 20s, was I sexually assaulted as a kid, I would have said no. So that's why it's estimates, and they have a range, because it's just impossible to get an accurate account. But even with the estimates, the numbers are still pretty staggering. And I'm sure the estimates are low. But it's estimated that 1 in 4 to 1 in 8 girls are sexually assaulted in their childhood, and 1 in 6 to 1 in 25 boys are sexually assaulted in their childhood. And there's other studies that suggest that up to 40% of children are sexually assaulted in their childhood. That in and of itself is pretty sobering. And, the other thing is that, so many of the perpetrators were themselves victims of abuse. So it's just so hard to get those kind of numbers. So now let's start to put this into perspective. So we have about...
This is the part that is stunning and startling.
Yeah. So if we use 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, that's 2 out of 10 children will be sexually assaulted in their childhood. That's 20%. So in a classroom with 30 students, 6 of those students will at some time in their childhood be sexually assaulted. When you start extrapolate and expand on that and look at our country, we have 330 million people in this country. 78% of them are adults, and 22% of them are children. So that means that we have approximately 257 million adults in this country and about 73 million children. So using that 20% abuse rate, that means there's over 51 million people, adults in this country, that have suffered some form of child sexual abuse in their youth. And
importantly, that often leads to them becoming a perpetrator later.
Well, the numbers on that are actually about 2% of child abuse victims end up becoming perpetrators. So that's what the data is showing. So vast majority of victims of child abuse don't become perpetrators, but a vast majority of perpetrators were victims of child abuse. So the data, there's varying degrees of levels of perpetrators. But, there's like 70% of perpetrators will have about 5 to 10 victims, and then there's like 20-some% of perpetrators that will have 20 to 40 victims or more. So if you kind of average all that out, each perpetrator will abuse about 8.5 kids during an 18-year period. So then, back to the 73 million children we have here, with a 20% abuse rate. That means right now we have 14.5 million children that are going to be sexually assaulted before they reach their 18th birthday. That equates to 800,000 children a year being sexually assaulted. 800,000. That's a staggering number to me. So,
and for many, the effects are lifelong.
Yes, yeah. So you combine the number of children that will be sexually assaulted with the adults that have been sexually assaulted. We have 66 million people in this country dealing with the after effects and or the current effects of being sexually assaulted. And the effects are dramatic. So many.
They're physical and psychological.
Yes.
Not just psychological, like a lot of people think. There's both components.
Yes. Yeah. There's a bunch of papers out and resources out there that really break it into those two categories of there's physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. And I in the blog that we wrote, it lists the various things that talk about the physical symptoms as well as the psychological symptoms. But basically, what all this shows is that victims of child sexual abuse have more health issues, more psychological issues, and often die younger than people that weren't victims of child abuse. So it creates this lifelong cycle, I guess, of events that adversely affect a person's life.
This is very real. That's what people don't seem to understand. The impact is physical. There's financial impact involved.
Yeah. So just as kind of some of the key things, there's a lot of physical things, a lot of stomach distress. There's obesity, eating disorders, sleeping disorders. So those are some of the physical ones. From an emotional standpoint, there's depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative states, repeated self-injury, addictive behaviors. So many victims of child abuse, child sexual abuse, become drug addicts, alcoholics, because there's such a pain, a void in the victim that they're trying to find ways to fill that pain, to make that pain go away. And I know, because I've felt it myself, and it takes a lot of work to get through that. And here was something I had no idea about, but I found an article that referred to a CDC report, or a report that the CDC was referencing, and it dealt with the healthcare costs over a person's life. So a victim of child sexual abuse, their average healthcare costs are $210,000 per person.
It's related from the abuse.
Yes, yeah, as a result of dealing with the physical and or psychological symptoms of being abused. So it's an extra $210,000 of cost for that person over the course of their life for healthcare. So just to give that some context, the lifelong financial burden of somebody having a stroke is about $160,000. So it's $50,000 a person more have been dealing with the issues of being sexually abused as a child versus having a stroke and the after effects of that in life.
Yeah, we immediately recognized how severe the consequences are of having a stroke and the medical care that's required. But I don't think very many people have any idea that the actual cost, the healthcare cost of someone being sexually abused as a child is even greater than a person having a stroke. That's insane.
And I put that into context for myself, and it's like, when I was a child, I had a lot of stomach disorders, and I remember being hospitalized and a bunch of tests ran on me to find out what was wrong with my digestive system. And basically they said I have a nervous stomach. So that was an expense directly related to being sexually assaulted. And then, throughout my adult life dealing with this, I did therapy for years with therapists. There's a cost for that. I did 3 inpatient stints with treatment centers. There was costs associated with that. So I'll bet, for me, I'm well over $200,000 spent, and fortunately, I've been in a position to spend that money to help heal from those issues.
Oh, most people could never get the care that they need.
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem is there's not enough people giving the care to help all the people that really, really need it. And then so much of it never gets to the root cause of why a person's an alcoholic. It's just, well, let's just treat the alcoholism, or let's treat the drug addiction, or the obesity. But, well, why did they become that? What are the issues that led them down that path? There's so much of just treating the symptoms as opposed to, finding the cause and let's treat the cause.
All right, so some people are very motivated to do something when they hear there's this huge financial factor, this huge cost that affects everybody in this country.
Yeah.
If you add this up, what's the cost, the total cost?
Yeah. I got to find that number.
Well, 66 million child abuse victims, that comes out to, what, $14 trillion?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
$14 trillion that could be a savings, a financial savings. So even if people are never, they think, well, it didn't impact me. Right. I'm not a victim. I'm not a survivor. So, well, it impacts everyone.
Yeah.
Because there's a $14 trillion cost
to victims of sexual child abuse.
Exactly.
Yep. So yeah, it does affect everybody. Yeah. The other point that, we kind of touched on this earlier, but there's research that suggests that 75% of sexual offenders, so child sexual abusers, were themselves victims of child abuse. So, and I think that actually is probably low. Percentage is probably much, much higher, just for the reasons we talked about earlier, the people not wanting to admit or just not knowing. But when you look at, because there's a stigma of that if I was sexually abused, I'm going to end up being a perpetrator. That the data doesn't pan that out, because when you look at roughly, each sex offender abuses 8.5 children. When you start using the math, it's roughly of the number of perpetrators in this country, there's roughly 1.7 million active child sex offenders in this country. So with over 666 million people having been victim, we're less than 2%, or about 2% of the people that were victims actually become perpetrators. I know that was kind of a lot of
But a high percentage
numbers.
of perpetrators were victims.
Right, yeah. So a high percentage of perpetrators were victims. But
that still doesn't mean, though, I get the math.
But a very, very low percentage of victims become perpetrators. So there's that stigma that just isn't true of that, oh, I was abused, so I'm going to be a perpetrator. That's the data doesn't bear that out.
Often people have, I think a lot of people have the opposite reaction. If they're abused as a child, they become very anti-abuse, and they would never do that to their kids or to anyone.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not 100% though.
But we still have 1.7 million active sex offenders in this country, abusing 8.5 children on average. So then you get up to that 14.5 million children that are going to be sexually abused.
I think what you're telling me is, and we've discussed this before, and it's kind of a taboo topic because it's very sensitive, but for abuse to end, potential abusers and abusers need help of some type.
Right.
I mean, incarcerating them, sure.
Yeah.
But if there's a way to stop them from becoming a perpetrator, that'd be ideal.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, our message and the message of the bike ride that I'll be doing in starting in September is stop abusing kids. And that message is directed towards abusers. They need to stop abusing because that's the only way it's gonna stop. Now, this isn't in this, but I read this that we have 800,000 children being abused every year. The number of arrests for child sexual abuse is about 40,000 a year. So it's 2% of incidences of child abuse actually result in an arrest. That doesn't mean conviction, just an arrest.
It would be even better, though, if they never became a perpetrator.
Right, right.
If they realize they have a tendency and they go get treatment before they take action.
Right.
What's the math on that, Tim? I mean, if you could even reduce them by a little bit, what's the...
Yeah, if we have 1.1% less children being sexually abused a year, we'd have 18,700 in the first year. And within 10 years, we'd have 209,000 less victims. That's 209,000 less children that would have been sexually assaulted. That's 209,000 less adults when they reach adulthood that are going to have to deal with those issues.
I'm looking at the math. So in 10 years, we'd have 275,000 fewer abusers and 2.4 million fewer victims. But that's a humongous impact.
Yeah. And that's just reducing it by 1.1% a year for the next 10 years. That's something as a society I think we can do if we make this a topic of discussion and make it less taboo to talk about and make it less taboo to seek treatment for the adverse effects of being abused as a child, sexually abused as a child. So, and
of course, the stats on abuse outside of sexual abuse are just staggering beyond belief.
Yeah. Yeah. So one more thing before I move on to that. So, in that 10-year period, if we have 2.4 million less children, that's $500 billion less that would be spent on the lifetime financial burdens of having to deal with child sexual abuse.
Just that one little
Just 1.1% for the next 10 years.
$500 billion.
$500 billion saved.
And more importantly, way fewer victims.
2.4 million less victims.
Yeah.
And like you said, that's only a small percentage of people that have actually suffered abuse as a child. So, there's other forms of child abuse. There's physical, emotional, there's poverty, there's abandonment, neglect. So there's a term out that I just came across, but I'm not sure, it's probably been out for a while, but they lump all forms of child abuse into what they call adverse childhood experiences. So when you start looking at that data, there's a study that the CDC cites that estimates that 62% of adults at one time in their childhood had at least one adverse childhood experience. What the data also suggests is that no matter what the event was, whether it was sexual, physical, emotional, the adverse effects all go back to those physical and or psychological damages. So the cost of having to deal with that are in that same vein. So it really is, it's staggering. So you're putting that into context. That's 3 times more victims of general abuse than just sexual abuse. So you start putting that into numbers. That means 160 million of the 257 million adults that we have in this country have had at least one adverse childhood experience. And that means that 45 million of the 72 million children that we have in this country will experience at least one adverse childhood experience before their 18th birthday. So if you use the same life financial burdens that we did for child sexual abuse to adverse childhood experiences, that's $45 trillion because almost 2/3 of our population have that, will experience at least one adverse childhood experience.
So you and I both personally have taken a hard stance. Athalonz has taken a hard stance. Our new nonprofit, Interwoven Circles, and the bike ride you're doing, we're not, this isn't, this needs to be a mainstream discussion. It's stop abusing kids.
Right.
That
right.
needs to be a regular topic in the mainstream that everybody talks about and is aware of all the time. It's time to stop abusing kids.
Absolutely. All forms of abuse. And, and for those that think, oh, well, this isn't my problem, with 62% of our country having these experiences, that's everybody's problem. Yeah, it's just, we all know, I mean, that means in this room, there's 3 of us. That means 2 of us have had at least one adverse childhood experience. So it's everybody's problem. So we need this to become a mainstream discussion. We need perpetrators to stop perpetrating. We need victims of child abuse to be able to get the treatment that they need so they can feel better about themselves. So, and it's going to just make the world a better place.